Hello and welcome to the HIV Cure podcast. My name is Sakabo Marumo and we are back again with another exciting episode. We are just here to bring you the simple HIV cure science, to break down the science for you to understand and be an advocate for an HIV cure in your countries and around the world. Today we're doing episode 6 and we're talking ethical and social considerations in HIV cure and vaccine research. I am bringing you another exciting guest who will be explaining to us the importance of ethical considerations and the role of community in HIV cure research, as well as just making sure that we protect them when it comes to doing research. She will be just explaining more, and yes. Hi, and welcome to our podcast.
Hi, how are you? Very good,
well,
thank you.
All right, thank you for joining us on the HIV Cure podcast. Can you please introduce yourself so that we get to learn more about you, the work you do?
Thank you. I'm Karine Dubé. I'm an associate professor at the University of California, San Diego, in the Division of Infectious Diseases and Global Public Health. And I'm a social behavioral scientist who's been studying the social and ethical aspects of HIV cure-related research for at least the past decade. And I'm really excited to be here today.
Yes, and we are also excited and happy to have you here. Today we're talking ethical and social considerations in HIV cure and vaccine research. On the earlier episodes, we did touch a little bit on the importance of ethical considerations and the role of community also when it comes to research and also how do we make sure that we protect them. And today we're going to dive more into it, and you are going to help explain to us what this really means. And, to start off, what does informed consent mean? People just, or they're asked to be part of research, clinical trials, and they don't really know. So can you please explain to us what informed consent is and why is it important when it comes to HIV cure or HIV vaccine trials? Why is informed consent very important?
Thank you. That is a really great question. Well, informed consent is a process, not just a form. This ensures participants understand the purpose, the risks, the benefits, and alternatives of a research study before they decide to participate. So this is rooted in respecting participants' autonomy and the right to make a voluntary, well-informed decision about their health and their bodies. And informed consent's importance is really heightened in the context of HIV cure and vaccine trials because these involve complex science, also higher risks and uncertainty. In HIV cure-related trials, in particular, participants may face analytical treatment interruptions, which is the interruption of standard therapy to see if an intervention has been efficacious. They also face invasive procedures and long-term unknowns. So this makes clear communication about their participation essential. But we know that we still have ways to go to inform the informed consent process. We need to make forms shorter, maybe more focused on the information that really matters to potential participants.
All right. And then now when we're talking about fairness, how can researchers make sure that people from all backgrounds are treated fairly when it comes to these different studies that are ongoing?
Thank you. When I think about fairness, I think about equity and justice. And to me, it's really actively engaged from diverse racial, ethnic, gender, and socioeconomic backgrounds to ensure that the research reflects the communities that are most affected by HIV. It's also really important to partner with community leaders and advocates throughout the entire research process to ensure that study design, also language and procedures are culturally appropriate and responsive to local needs. We also have ways to go to removing structural and logistical barriers that prevent specific groups from participating. For example, transportation, childcare, language access, and even the digital divide. So we can design trials that are inclusive and not just representative, and that means addressing their specific health, social, and ethical concerns of diverse populations from the very start.
So I am a young person who's openly living with HIV. I do advocate for an HIV cure, and then just also for different issues that are affecting young people that are living with HIV in Botswana, in Africa, and globally, to say that we need some of the things changed, some of the policies, so that we too can have somewhat a normal life, and just being a voice to those that may not know how to express themselves. And now my question is about diversity. Why is it important for people living with HIV to have a voice in HIV decisions?
Yeah, that is really, really critical. People with HIV bring really essential lived experiences that could really help shape research questions and priorities in how we design clinical trials to make sure that these can reflect real world needs and realities. I think the involvement of people with HIV helps ensure that studies are grounded in the realities of people who are most affected. And this helps make the research more meaningful, more acceptable, and more likely to succeed in the long term. So we need to build trust between communities and researchers, particularly in groups that have faced a long history of stigma and marginalization and unethical research practices. So it's a matter of justice and respect. And clinical trials, if we do formative research leading up to the clinical trials, but if we also ask participants how they experience the clinical trials so we can design better trials in the long term. And in HIV cure research, the key issues are informed consent, which we've already talked about, but also partner protections and participant protections, reducing trial burdens. These trials are pretty complex and intensive, and also ensuring that we support participants' mental and psychosocial needs. So we think that incorporating social behavioral sciences can help us better understand these factors while honoring the lived experience and the voice of people with HIV.
And then now when we're talking about access, what are some of those risks to say that if only wealthy countries or wealthy people have access to an HIV cure or an HIV vaccine, how is this a risk to the world or to others that don't have that access to it?
Yeah, that is a really important question that relates to equity and access. I think limiting access to only high-income countries or individuals would deepen existing global health disparities, particularly in regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, where the burden of HIV is the highest. So we need to plan and design clinical trials in resource-limited settings. I think this also raises ethical concerns, particularly for groups that have been historically marginalized or those that have borne the brunt of the epidemic. So we need to make sure we leave no one behind, and we need to make sure that we build clinical trials with trust, and that we build capacity, we ensure mutual benefits, we engage resource-limited settings in this really important body of research. A cure or a vaccine is only effective at a population level if it's accessible to all of those who need it. So we really need to think about building clinical trials with clear solidarity principles. And I think that's a really important matter of shared responsibility. That's a great question. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. I do try by all means that when I ask these questions, they're very inclusive and also just to reassure our listeners when it comes to their safety, because a lot of them are also sort of skeptical and are hesitant when it comes to joining clinical trials or joining ongoing research that is happening. So through these questions, I just want them to understand that their safety always comes first. And also when we're talking about safety, we did mention earlier on that you are from the United States of America and I'm from Botswana, and we do know that there's still ongoing research, HIV cure research around the world. And now that we're talking about different people and different cultures, how can HIV cure research be done in a way that respects the different local cultures and communities around the world?
Yeah, that is a really important question. So I think it's really important to involve community members and local leaders early and often from the earliest stage of research design, not just when we need people to participate in research. We also need to make sure that the study aligns with local values and priorities. So this should not be tied to a specific trials, but should really be done to build trust and ensure trustworthiness of the research and the researchers. We also need to make sure that we use language, metaphors, and messaging that can resonate with local cultural beliefs and practices. So cure-related research is really complicated, so we need to avoid technical jargon and ensure that are translated and culturally adapted and appropriate. And that takes time and it takes a process and investing in community patient engagement. So we also need to build local partnerships with trusted local organizations, healthcare providers, community advisory boards to really understand the cultural landscape, and this can guide ethical engagement. We can also train local researchers and ensure that whatever research is planned can have benefits for all parties involved. This also requires approaching communities with humility, listening deeply, and being willing to adapt based on community feedback and concerns. So whatever input we receive from communities, we need to make sure that we incorporate that into our research protocols. These are my thoughts.
Oh, great. And I love them, and I love the point where you talked about some of the language to the local community so that they understand more, and also that I do know that some also use interpreters, people to translate from like English to the local languages that are spoken in different countries, just so that they are fully able to understand, and also are using different platforms like social media, and also through this podcast here where we're just explaining generally what research is, the role of community scientists, so that they're also able to speak up for themselves when they're asked to join these clinical trials. And also when we're talking about safety and protections, what should scientists as well as governments do to protect all participants in HIV cure or HIV vaccine trials from harm, or just protecting them from stigma?
Yeah, these are great questions. So we need to have really robust regulatory review of protocols and also ensure that we follow local ethical guidelines. We also need to protect participants' identities with strong data privacy and security measures, particularly in contexts where HIV can still be stigmatized and where people living with HIV may be discriminated against. So we need to design trials that are stigma sensitive, so including avoiding potentially stigmatizing language. We have to be very careful with that. We also need to ensure that we have a community-based review of the protocol. That is a critical safeguard in the research process. So we need to be sensitive to local stigma dynamics. In HIV cure-related research, we need to be able to measure if there's any mental health impacts, for example, and provide counseling and peer support before, during, and after participation. We know that analytical treatment interruptions can be emotionally challenging, so I think that's really important. We also need to train research teams to be sensitive to potential stigma, and we also need to make sure that we integrate social behavioral sciences and ethics. This can help us understand the consequences of the research and then potentially mitigate against potential harm. So we need to be very alert and sensitive as we design and implement clinical trials.
Great. And when now we're talking about inclusivity, making sure that during these clinical trials, we want all communities to be a part of it, or yes, this research, so that when now we're saying that this HIV cure or this HIV vaccine is working, we are very sure that all communities were represented during clinical trials. How do you make sure that young people, women, or other key populations aren't left out when it comes to HIV cure research?
Yeah, I think we need to design protocols with these different populations in mind. Um, So we need to make sure that we design studies that address their needs at the forefront as a central priority, not as an afterthought. And so we need to better engage these groups to see how they would like to be meaningfully engaged and recruited in the research process. We also need to be careful with our inclusion-exclusion criteria. So we need to balance safety with representation and inclusion. Of course, representation and diversity and equity and inclusion, but at the same time, we don't want to cause any undue harm. So we have to make sure that we provide adequate safeguards if we engage groups that could face, potential vulnerabilities. So I'll give you an example. For example, if we were to include younger women in HIV cure-related research with analytical treatment interruptions, we would really want to be providing good and robust psychosocial support during the entire trajectory of the treatment interruption so that people feel supported, particularly around negotiating, for example, disclosure, not just of HIV, but also the ATI. So that requires being really sensitive to people's need as they participate. So really going beyond biomedical endpoints to really think about the full participant, the holistic needs of the participants. We also need to create tailored to the needs and language of diverse communities, particularly young people. We also need to have supportive research environments, trauma-informed research, healing center design. I think we need to evolve some of the clinical trials now, particularly in the new reality that we are in, to really be attuned to the needs of participants. And then if we do engage these groups, we really need to analyze and report findings by age, sex, gender identity, and other relevant factors to really understand what's happening.
Now, after research is done and all these different groups or different communities were part of these clinical trials, everything is working, it's fine. I'm going to give an example that recently, or last week, you could see that lenacapavir, the every 6 months has been approved by the FDA, and now it's ready for use. Now let's talk about the benefits now of all this research. That what can be done to make sure that benefits of research are shared fairly, especially with low income communities.
Yeah, that's a really, really critical question. And I think it talks to the point around post-trial access and our commitments there. I think we need to have really clear plans for post-trial access to these interventions so that communities who contribute to the science are not left waiting if a cure or vaccines or long-acting agent proves to be successful. So I think we need to work with governments and pharmaceutical companies to support tiered pricing models, generic production, and also licensing can prioritize access for research-limited settings. So I think we can build clinical trials with equity and acceptability outcomes as part of the design. Together with safety and efficacy, I think we really need to think about cost effectiveness of these interventions as we design clinical trials. So that's a really great question.
Thank you. And then now the other issue now becomes that we have been talking about stigma. Stigma has been there for a very long time. Every year we're talking about stigma, and people are like, we are so tired about talking about stigma. And now my question is that how does stigma around HIV affect people's willingness to now join trials or to take part when it comes to HIV vaccine research?
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think that stigma in HIV cure-related research can go both ways. It's difficult to evaluate, and I think this is why we need to incorporate stigma or self-image measures as part of trials. And when we talk about stigma, there are many different kinds of stigma. For example, internal stigma, external, structural, and intersectional stigma. In particular, analytical treatment interruptions imply some sort of disclosure, not just of the HIV, but also the treatment interruption. So this is a highly complex issue because in the era of U equals U, or undetectable is untransmittable, during an ATI, this equation can be broken. So people may have viremia in their blood and they may be able to transmit HIV. So we need to really understand this in the context of people's lives. And so I think that's a really important question. We also know that we need to be attuned to participate in these clinical trials. We need to normalize HIV cure and vaccine research through public education and storytelling that celebrates participants as key contributors to the science. We also need to work with community members and leaders and peer educators to help reduce stigma around participation in clinical trials, particularly right now, in the new era as different programs are being dismantled.
Yes, and you talked about celebrating participants in trials or in research. Then now, my question now is to these participants or to the community now. What role can communities play in holding researchers as well as policymakers accountable during HIV cure and HIV vaccine development?
Yeah, community members and advocates have a critical role to play during cure and vaccine development. As I mentioned earlier, they are a critical safeguard in the research process. So communities can help monitor the design and the conduct of clinical trials. They can help us ensure that researchers respect participant rights and follow ethical protocols and uphold our promises of transparency and fairness. They should also help shape the design of clinical trials. And so we really need their voice front and center to help shape this agenda. Communities can also insist on clear and accessible communication about trials and trials goals, risks, fundings, and outcomes. We also need to advocate for equitable access, as we discussed earlier, from the very beginning, and promote local ownership. So communities need to be involved during the entire trajectory of the research process. And they can also help us call out injustices and hold institutions accountable. And ultimately, community members and patient participants and advocates are true partners in the research process.
All right. Thank you so much for making the time to join us on the podcast. And I am now going to ask you to put you on the spotlight to say that what superpower would you give researchers to make sure that no one, absolutely no one in the fight towards an HIV cure is left behind?
Yeah, I think particularly right now, I think a superpower would be to be able to unlock funding to support the research fairly and equitably. I think funds are limited, and I think to make sure that we continue making progress, we'll need to sustain the funding for the HIV cure research infrastructure and vaccine clinical trials in general. So I think I would give the superpower of being able to ensure fundings in critical spaces right now. And I would also, another superpower would be to help amplify the voices of people with HIV to ensure that their priorities can guide every step of the research process and policymaking.
Wow, I love that. Thank you so much. Talking about our voices of people living with HIV and also funding, because we do know that funding research is just it's heartbreaking right now at the moment, but we're just hoping that things get better or things will go back to normal or even way, way better than it was before. Because right now things are not looking good. But thank you so much for explaining the concepts and everything around the ethical as well as social considerations in HIV cure and HIV vaccine research. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having me. And I think it's really important to have a long-term view of HIV cure-related research. I think we need to be there for the long term. And so
Yes.
I thank you so much for doing this podcast.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, please comment below or also just send me a message. I'll forward through so that we are able to explain. And also if you have any other topics that you would like us to discuss or to explore, do below and we will surely do that for you. Thank you for joining today's podcast. I'll catch you on the next one. Have a lovely one. Goodbye.